Well, good afternoon, everyone, and please allow me to reconvene our happy group. I'm Adam Posen, president of the Peterson Institute for International Economics, and it's our pleasure to have you back for the latest in our series of joint events with McKinsey Global Institute. We're very pleased and proud of this series. It allows us and them to present some of our respective best work and engage in some pretty serious dialogue, as many of you who watched the initial session with Jan Mischke from MGI and with Bill Klein and Nicholas Veron from the Institute this morning. Today, we're particularly pleased and honored. We have two superstars to talk about the European longer-term growth perspective and structural issues. We have Eric Labaye, who is chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute, as well as a member of the Shareholders Council of McKinsey. More on him in a moment. And we have our newest senior fellow, Olivier Blanchard, who is the first ever C. Fred Bergsten Senior Fellow at the Institute. And as Fred himself has said, there could be no one better for that role. And we are delighted. And after 2 weeks in the office, Olivier seems to still be with us, so this is good. Again, more on him later. Just a brief note about McKinsey Global Institute and the Peterson Institute. As some of you have seen this sign, it's the 25th anniversary of McKinsey Global Institute, and there actually was a celebration last night that I got to participate in a little bit of. Thank you for the hospitality. The Peterson Institute and McKinsey Global Institute have been crossing paths back and forth for well over a decade now. Bill Lewis, in some of his initial work, was coming here and presenting occasionally. Martin Bailey, who was a senior fellow here until he decided to revert back to domestic focus, was here and, of course, has been very involved with the McKinsey Global Institute for a long time. Importantly, Martin and Jacob Kierkegaard, who hosted our morning session, produced a book on European structural reform and long-term growth about a dozen years ago that still, I think, remains authoritative in many ways. And it came into dialogue with the McKinsey report on Europe at the time. And so we're delighted to sort of have come full circle now and be bringing those back together. We continue to do more exchange with McKinsey Global Institute, playing to, as one should, various comparative advantages. Ours, particularly in the macroeconomic and trade space, as well as thinking about some of the policy institutions. McKinsey Global Institute's, of course, on the productivity and sectoral side where we can learn so much. We will be continuing this in mid-November. We are doing a day-long important conference here on the global productivity slowdown, including speeches by Robert Gordon, Larry Summers, and various other lesser lights. But one of the not-so-lesser lights is Jana Rames, who's one of the managing partner in the McKinsey Global Institute practice, and she'll be contributing to that event as well. So, with all that aside, there is still room for disagreement on some of these issues, and I'm sure that will become evident over the course of this discussion, as it was in the morning. So I'm delighted to welcome to the podium Eric Labaye. Based in Paris, Eric is, as mentioned, chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute and a member of the Shareholders Council of the firm. He was managing director of the France office from 2002 to 2010 and led the firm's global knowledge and communications function. We like to think of ourselves as global knowledge, but anyway, from 2010 to 2013, he served on various high-level commissions on France's economic future, has been a member of the board of Telecom Paris Tech and the International Advisory Board of ESSEC. He also did some great public service in terms of defining a new model for the French university hospital system. Prior to joining McKinsey now 30 years ago, Eric was a member of the Corps des Télécommunications, forgive my pronunciation, at France Telecom. He's a graduate from École Polytechnique, like our colleague Nicholas Veron, and holds an MBA with distinction from INSEAD. But most of all, he's here to tell us how Europe can make the most of its window of opportunity. Eric.
Thank you very much for your kind introduction, and good afternoon to everyone. I'm glad to be here to discuss, in fact, where Europe can go or could go. But as you were reminding a bit of the history of MGI, I think we I was glad also to see Olivier here because we cooperated together on some of the similar issues on Germany and France 10 years ago. And as we will see, some of the questions about how to rejuvenate growth in Europe are still around. So the focus of the discussion is going to be on some work we have been doing over the past year when we saw somehow Europe stuck with a low growth. And having looked at many countries, many sectors around Europe where we were seeing some growth potential, we asked the question about what can Europe do to really reignite the growth path. So what I would like to do first is to maybe share with you a few perspectives on Europe that you may not have in mind first in terms of some of the facts, and then go into the topic of how do we get both the structural reforms you talked about as well as the demand going in terms of reigniting growth. So just to start, when you think about, at least on the Eurozone side, sometimes we say Europe has done nothing or little in the past few years. And in fact, when you look at some of the facts, like here, the adjustment on the labor cost side or on the current account balance, in fact, something has been done. Even I would say a lot has been done by many countries, knowing that in the Eurozone, at least a currency is a currency, so you cannot do anything with that. But then, evolution have been happening. On the labor side, we see Spain, we see Greece, Ireland has been doing also a lot of things, Italy a bit. France, not too much. But roughly vis-à-vis Germany, I think a lot of adjustment have been made, mainly by internal adjustment in many of these countries. And similarly, on the current account balance, competitiveness has been regained by some of the countries. Obviously, there is an import effect here into the numbers, but somehow, there has been closing this gap and restoring some of the right balances. So there has been somehow some resilience on the European countries and adjustment and evolution over the past few years. Second, however, there is obviously an important potential opportunity to accelerate the growth. Interestingly enough, in previous years before the crisis, when you look at the GDP per capita here, Europe has been going at a faster rate than the US in terms of the GDP per capita. After that, it basically fall deeper, recovered until 2011. So we were on similar foot in 2011. But I would say the past 3-4 years, this is where we have seen the divergence between the Europe 30 here, because we have taken the 28 of the EU plus Switzerland and Norway to get all the European countries. But so this is where now we have a 6-point gap between the Europe 30 and the US. Therefore, highlighting that accelerating basically the growth is absolutely necessary and clearly to fill the gap. I would highlight, however, that this average performance has a wide variation or variance. Countries like Poland have grown 20%, the GDP per capita since 2008. Some other countries like France are just at the level of the Europe 30. Germany is at parity with the US. So we see this is one of the characteristics of Europe, is we always talk about the average, but the performance of the different countries obviously is very different on many dimensions. And I will come back on that. So here, the simple message is Europe needs to basically reignite its growth engine to boost again the GDP per capita, which is just at the level of 2008, 7 years later. Now, when you look at what has happened in terms of the evolution of the GDP, we compare here the 2008 and the 2014, which is roughly similar in terms of size, but trying to understand what have been the variations among the different components. Clearly, the big fall has been on investment. It has been obviously talked about that, both corporate investment on the left as well as household investment linked to the deleveraging on the household, but also the corporate have taken 10 to 15% out of their investments. And this has been compensated by two elements, a big one being net exports, which has been a main driver somehow, in particular in the first years between 2008 and 2013, as well as some of the government consumption that we have seen in some countries. So very clear view of the balance. Now the question is obviously going to be, on the left side, how can we boost the investment, in particular the investment of the corporations, knowing that at the same time, when you look at the balance sheet of the largest corporations in Europe, they have 800 billion in cash. So again, this is not a question of, is the money available or is there the ability to invest? It's more creating the context and the will to invest to basically close these gaps. Now, in that context, let's step back a minute also in terms of some of the characteristics of the European countries and some of the elements that make us, I would say, positive on the dynamic is when you look at the performance right now of the economies, and here we took some of the OECD numbers in terms of both the societal well-being as well as later on we look at the economic performance. In fact, when you look at the European average as well as the spread here is between the top country and the worst country on this dimension in the Europe 30. Somehow two things here. One side is compared to the US, the average on this dimension is pretty good, at least on several of the dimensions. The second is you have always also a European country which is, let's say, best practice in the world. And we see, the ones on the left, be, Finland or Germany on education, be Sweden or Finland on living environment, etc. So somehow one element is, in average, Europe is doing pretty well on this dimension that sometimes we don't talk too much about. And the second, some good practices are just around the corner. And I will come back to that in terms of how do the Europeans somehow learn from each other, because some of the countries have been basically performing pretty well on these dimensions. Similarly, on economic health, here maybe not as strong, but roughly the average. I think the only element which I think has been known, and we have seen it very often in our MGI studies on productivity, is the agility. Is the only dimension on which the US has clearly a lead. It's a more agile economy than, I would say, all of the European countries, even if Sweden is not too bad in terms of, on the OECD ranking. But so here again, we have a, good performance. Some of the countries also are very best performing. And therefore, when we think about the way forward, the question is going to be how do we leverage this performance, or these countries that are performing well in the context of the EU. And the second also, when we think about the economics, how also do we build on the societal elements? Because as we talk about, or as we know, very often the discussion are on all dimensions, be societal and economic. So to put also some light to this, third element I wanted to highlight, we did a survey with 16,000 Europeans in 8 countries on these dimensions of what matters for them. We use basically a conjoint analysis that sometimes we use for more marketing purposes, but we use that here to say, when you think about what you value, what is it, and what are the trade-offs you are ready to make. And what we got were that the Europeans somehow are valuing the pieces that are at the top, clearly buying power, but education, health, public safety. But at the same time, what they were saying is, frankly, if you tell me that, this is going to work, I'm okay to relinquish a bit of social protection or to work a bit more. So this question of the trade-offs, obviously there is a if, which is, we want to make sure that if we do that, public safety is going to be better, healthcare is going to be better, education is going to be better, which is another topic about, can the government basically deliver on that? But when we look at the citizens themselves, and this was true in the 8 countries, they are pretty, I would say, clear on the opportunity and ready to do something. The differences between countries is not very big, but it happens. For example, Spain, that has been going through a major social evolution, the social protection is at 0. They say, no more on the social protection. On the other hand, okay to work a bit longer. Some other countries are a bit different, but the direction is basically, always one of the two is okay, and none of them is on the other side. So here, European countries that have good examples, citizens that are ready to do something. So this is why when you think about the window of opportunity, it's not only an external window of opportunity, but also there are some internal elements to take into account to believe that we can move forward. And when we said, what is the order of magnitude here, we have roughly 15% of the GDP, 10 years down the road. So it's not small in terms of the efforts or the evolution that the citizens are ready to do. Which is when we think about the growth impact of this, when we, the do-nothing scenario right now is between 0 and 1, which is what we have seen over the past few years. Right now, and this is a window somehow, there are boom factors, at least 3 of them, between the oil price, the QE, the evolution of the euro, that we quantified roughly 0.8 to 1.5%. So this is what we see today in terms of the potential that has been realized. The question is, this is like a one-time effect. So how do we get to an ongoing growth? And here, as I mentioned, the third element is a European aspiration. Roughly 1.5% would be required to do that. Therefore, I would say 2 to 3% is going to be what will be required to fulfill the European aspirations. And I'm going to dig into the green element, which is where can we find growth drivers to basically deliver on that. But somehow building on what the European wants, leveraging the current context to move is somehow a main message I wanted to bring to you. Therefore, the question in front of the European countries and the European leaders is this one, which is on one side, we need to reform to boost competitiveness. And as you will see in a minute, most of that is going to be at the national level. So it's these structural reforms. They need to be moving. At the same time, also, we need to get the right demand or the right financing to get the investment and job creation. And the dilemma here is a lot of that is done at the European level. So I'll come back to that in a minute. But the point that action is mainly at the country on some elements of reforms, and on some others, the financing is more at the European level. This is where I think the gridlock is right now. And what we have been trying to do is to say, how do we get that moving? So let me zoom first on the reforms. And basically, we have identified three topics. No, I don't think you would be surprised because most of them obviously have been either studied or evaluated or mentioned. But what we did is, between the investment for the future, the market conditions and productivity, and mobilization of the workforce, trying to understand what could be done. And here the approach we have taken is say, what is the best practice in Europe? And somehow, if we were bringing over time, over 10 years, some of the laggards, let's say, or not best practice to a first quartile, what would that mean? Not the best, but in the top 20 to 30%. What would that bring? And then obviously it's going to be how do we get that done? And when we look at this is the type of results we get. We try to quantify as precisely as we could the effect. And this is in percent of growth, so 0.26%. And when we add this, we get between 2 to 3% of potential growth. Obviously, the question is going to be, can we move on all dimensions in parallel? That's obviously one of the challenge. The second element, as I mentioned, we have two colors in the bubbles. One is in orange, the other one is blue. The orange is what can be done at the national level, country by country, and in blue at the European level. And when you add that up, it's a 75-25. Roughly 75% of the reforms can or should be done by the government individually in each country. 25% of this has to be supported by a joint effort, like single market and so on, at the European level. So that's why I would say the will of the governments to drive the reforms is pretty important, because that's not Europe which is going to drive the structural reform. In fact, it's each government determining if they want to do the 75%. They can get some help on the 25, but on the 75, it's really their own decision to drive this reform. To give some example, I may start, in fact, with mobilizing the workforce, which is one element where it has been a lot in discussion recently, in particular around the participation, grey and female labor force participation. There are clearly countries in the Nordics that have been pretty adapting their labor force. The question here is, how do we get more, let's say, flexibility, evolution of the retirement age, evolution of the childcare, evolution of the lifelong training. So there are many measures that, frankly, is a question of how do we get other countries to learn from that, adapt it. Again, everything has to be customized to every country. But some of them have shown their impact. And here the question is, how do we get that spread around Europe? Another one on the labor market flexibility. This is clearly something, if I look just at France, which I've been looking deeply for years, this is number one, let's say number one break right now on the growth. And how do we get this going in terms of somehow reallocating from the old sectors to the new sectors? How do we retrain people to move them to the new sectors? This is what is behind that. Similarly here, some of the Nordics, Denmark in particular, have, Germany also have put in practice some elements that have been interesting at least and impactful in terms of their development of their economy. So this is the type of things we are talking about here. If I move up to the market conditions, the first one is really around obviously the establishment of a single market and to ensure the right level of smart competition between in different sectors at the European level, but also in every sector and country across Europe. So here it's a digital. Digital is one of them. Services. We know that services has been. The directive on services has not been fully implemented. So the question is, can we move on that? There is a clear correlation between smart regulation, services, and productivity and growth associated to that. So how do we move on this? Most of the countries that have been accelerating on the services side have shown productivity gain over time. Right now, the digital market, obviously, is one of the key elements, getting the right norms, getting the same infrastructure, leveraging somehow the 500 million inhabitants. That's really when you think about the core asset of Europe, it's really this size of consumers, well-educated. But if we can get to one market and continue to get to one market from an operating mode, mainly around norms and regulation, obviously this can accelerate growth and productivity. Public sector productivity, we obviously huge in the European countries, public sector. And here we talk more about the operations of public sector, not the redistribution side, which is a different discussion. But on productivity here, we have, there are a lot of opportunities just to raise, to liberate or to get some of the spending more back to the private sector, or to be able to then reduce taxes through that. So and get back more consumption. So that's somehow some of the levers here. Many countries have started launching some productivity improvement, projects or initiatives, and the question is, how do we get more to do that around Europe? Obviously, openness to trade. This is really how do we raise the trade, or at least the agreement, obviously with the US, but also over time with India, with China, with the main trade partners, and how do we get that going obviously on the right principle, but as we have seen, trade over time basically support the growth. So that's what is behind that. On the left, to finish, on the investing for the future, ecosystem for innovation. That's similarly here. I can put also in part of that is around the digital market, around common procurement, common network of clusters. How do we get basically the innovation more on the European basis working, and get basically some more innovation, more productivity out of that. Education to employment, another topic we have been focusing on, which is how do we get the youth? I was talking about the grey and female labor force participation. One big issue in many countries has been how do we get the youth into the labor market? And we had done some work in very much detail a couple of years ago. And what obviously we found some countries like Germany, like Switzerland, have less of a problem of that because they have very thorough approach to get the youth into the system. We have also found that there is a big discrepancy between what the education institutions are thinking about, adapting the youth to the new skills. 80% of these institutions say, I'm adapting very well to the new skills. When we ask employers and the youth, they say 30% of them say yes, 70% say no, I didn't get the right skills to get into the labor market. So somehow closing this gap, ensuring the institution are adapting the young people to the skills of tomorrow with the different channels to get to the right sectors, the right profession, is somehow part of that. And here there is clearly a potential to get quicker, sooner participation and therefore some growth out of that versus having the 25% unemployment we have in many countries around Europe. Let me finish on the last three. Infrastructure, there is a 0.5 0.3% gap between what the right level of infrastructure should be in Europe and what it is today. So here the question is, how could we close this gap in terms of basically getting the right infrastructure again across countries. And obviously some countries are above, some countries are behind. So it's going to be different by country in terms of what should be done. But that's what is behind this. The energy burden is two elements. One is, how do we get a European market around energy? Right now it's optimized in every country. And the second is, how do we move to the new energy, unconventional energy? And can we get a European perspective on that, common infrastructure, common plan, and then get this going? The last one on urban development, there is a wide variation of urbanization around Europe, between 85, 90% in the Netherlands, 30% in 35% in Eastern Europe. And we know there is a correlation between urbanization and GDP development. How do we get that going at the right pace with the right sustainable city? How do we get some of these countries to accelerate maybe their urbanization again in the right way, but then to support the GDP? So sorry, maybe I took a bit long, but just to mention all these levers, and I'm sure we have a discussion on how to get that done. But I would mention again that one element at least that struck us is that most of them, we talk always about Europe has to do the structural reform, and in fact a lot of these reforms are linked to, have to be done country by country. But most importantly, learning, and that's somehow how do countries learn from the others, and then adapt to their country. We see that a lot in the business world. When we have business unit, talking to each other. It's right now it's maybe less clear how though the 28 EU countries do that, understand the performance, understand the best practice, and then learn from that to accelerate. Maybe I said already, when I look at the 8 countries where we interviewed the citizen that I mentioned before, and we look at these 11 levers, in fact, what is interesting is, some of these countries obviously have been moving. So back to the best practice or the best practice in the transformation, because some of these countries have done that in the past 2 to 3 years. Obviously, as you can see, not everyone is working on all of them, which can be understood given the position. But then also is going to be how do the countries leverage the others or complete their if they are not in the best practice, for example on the mobilizing the workforce, how do we get that going? So here the question is more the scale. I was mentioning best practice. There are initiatives. Now is more how do we get more scale on these initiatives to accelerate the growth? Let me maybe accelerate because I mentioned these 3 things. Let me move to maybe the other element now. Here we saw the potential, 2 to 3% growth, productivity levels, country, European level. The question now is how do we get that going? Because there is this, let's say, budget fiscal constraint. And what we saw here is we tried to quantify somehow what is required to get the ball rolling. And the estimate we have is 2 to 4% of GDP required to do that. And obviously, it's not going to be, for every country. It can be more or less, but roughly at the European level, this would be the type of things that would be required. Similar to, cost of transition, to get the ball, to initiate, that's the type of things. And this is right now, the gridlock is between how do we get this financing, knowing that there is the Maastricht constraint, the fiscal constraint, and on the other hand, we see the opportunities, and some of them, like we see here, infrastructure, putting a European energy market, or getting innovation going, or improving education system. This requires some cost to initiate the transformation. So when we see that, let me move to the demand side now and say, how do I put the structural reform and the demand side together? Here is, at least, I'm sure we'll discuss that, but when we look at the US, UK, Eurozone, in terms of, the fiscal stimulus in 08-10, and then the GDP impact in 11-13, which is after 11 is when, as we saw on the first page, the gap starts. There is clearly, big difference. The fiscal impulse, by the way, between, here we don't see it, but the fiscal impulse in the US, the automatic one is small, and a big part of that, 7%, is roughly discretionary, while in Europe, the discretionary is more 1.5. So there is like a 1-to-4 ratio between the impulse that has been done by the Eurozone and the one that has been done in the US. And obviously, what we can see is the GDP has not been at the same level in terms of impact. It may not be the only, obviously, the only driver of that, but there is clearly at least an approach that has been different in terms of how to leverage a fiscal impulse. What is interesting also is with the growth rate, when you look at the evolution of the debt in the US has moved up by 40+%, and is roughly 100+, while Europe is, or Eurozone is going to be 90+. So the difference is not so huge at the end. It's 5 to 10%. It's not, 50 or 30 or 40%, because the growth rate also as the growth rate of GDP is higher, the debt on GDP has not grown as much. So there has been at least an equation that has been maybe more favorable here, and compared to what the Eurozone has been doing. So what we do as implication from that is somehow, how do we get together the reforms and the stimulus or the demand to make sure at least there is a financing for the reform? And here what we put on this is, what is feasible, and obviously how big is the impact? Trying to obviously be in the right corner as usual, saying what is feasible with big impact, knowing that there's some elements that are maybe less feasible with big impact. And we separated between what would require, in fact, a European federation versus what is feasible today. If I look at the top left, obviously, some people are arguing we need to do more than 3% in terms of fiscal approach. We should mutualize the debt. These are ideas that have been around for the past few years, since 2008, they have been here. And so, so here, obviously, this requires more federal approach to that. Now, on the right side, from the bottom, obviously, maximize spending from the current fiscal compact. Only Germany has 40 billion to spend. So the question is, obviously, maybe not in Germany, it's back to how do we leverage this? When we go above that, obviously, quantitative easing has been at work, improving access to finance for business. This is really relevant for SMEs, as I mentioned. For the big companies, they have the cash on the hand. And so we put 3 or 4 ideas on the table. One would be, can we account for the investment similarly to the business? Because right now, investments are accounted like cash every year, while in fact, they generate return later on. So can we put an accounting system where investment is, in fact, depreciated over time, which in the Maastricht context would help. Second would be to evolve taxation and wages across countries. In the sense we know that the low-income people have a higher propensity to spend. So is there a nice evolution on this to be done? And the third would be to leverage a grey economy. We know that the senior population has the wealth or the assets. How can we get the assets transferred to the younger population? Same thing, higher propensity to spend. So these are at least 3 ideas in a current governance context that could be put in place. And I think this morning you talked about the one in blue, which is the quote-unquote helicopter money in terms of, is it something that can be done directly instead of going through the government, directly going to the citizen, and maybe packaging that with some of the structural reforms. Maybe we could get helicopter money versus labor market flexibility. That's the type of ideas also we're putting on the table, which is this package view of let's do the demand and the reform together. Because right now what is at stake is somehow governments are saying, I would be okay to do the reform, but I need the money. And then the European group says, yeah, but if you don't do the reform, you don't get the money because there is a lack of trust in the middle. So how do we restore the trust? How do we restore the governance of working together is really what I think the challenge is. And some of these elements could be a way to start, and maybe over time, we move to the left. To conclude, I think the scenarios are, I think, here, if we go, if we're able to if we do spending on the right side, but we don't do the acceleration on the structuring, we're just going to spend more money without impact. The gridlock is no money, no reform. Obviously, we would like to be at the top with more demand stimulus and more reforms. Therefore, to synthesize, I think some of the ideas I mentioned, trying to get the 2 things together, the reforms of the competitiveness as well as the financing of the investment and job creation is really what is at stake. As we have seen, there are good examples in Europe of countries that have done that. So the question is really, one, on how do we leverage the best practice around Europe to the benefits of the ones who can have the opportunity to develop, which is an element around how is the EU doing that? Right now, nobody is best practicing or benchmarking between each other. So can we, can Europe move on that dimension in terms of learning from each other, understanding the potential, understanding what can be done? And last, in terms of the demand side, as I mentioned, some of the ideas beyond the one I mentioned is, can we get to some, combining reforms and packages or demand stimulus together? I mentioned energy before. I mentioned labor market reform. So how do we get to something which links demand and transformation? Because that's maybe one way we can get the engine going. So, sorry, I think I went a bit over, but thank you very much for your attention, and I'm sure we'll debate some of these ideas.
Thank you very much, Eric. This theme of trying to get the proper interaction, not just coordination, between demand policy and structural reforms is, of course, one that a number of people have touched on in the European context. I would like to point out that in December last year, we released Rebuilding Europe's Common Future, which Angel Ubide and I put together, including essays by Angel, A.J. Chopra, Paulo Moro, Jacob Kierkegaard, and Nicolas Veron, where we talked about the way to build trust on the fiscal side, sequence the reforms properly, motivate the proper monetary response, but most of all, to recognize that many structural reforms have a short-term drag component. Of course, that is something also that has been talked about and recognized by the IMF's work in real time during the crisis, which is not the only reason, but one of many reasons why we turn next to Olivier Blanchard. Olivier has joined the Institute, as I mentioned, on October 1st, after 7, shall we say, eventful, and I would argue very principled and productive years as the chief economist of the IMF from 2007 till the end of September 2015. Prior to that, he was, of course, the Robert Solow Professor at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, and for a while the chairman of the economics department there. His other accomplishments are too many to list, but I think the biggest one is the engagement with what was needed for Europe and trying to be honest and intellectually update what we should all be thinking about demand policy, structural reform policy in real time while the crisis was happening. Olivier has said publicly, and also as well to me and our colleagues, his main reason for coming to the Institute was to have time to reflect a bit longer term. And in that context, I ask Olivier to come up and give his reflections, both on the McKinsey report, but more broadly on the issue of European structural reform. Thank you, Olivier.
You're lucky. You're going to be treated to 2 French accents this afternoon. And also about long-term thinking. 2 weeks, I don't know, is not quite enough to be there. I'm very happy to discuss this paper. Let me make sure I can see it on the screen, which I don't. Do I have to look there? I mean, should it appear here as well? This is irrelevant? Yeah. Good. Okay. Well, I'm going to do this. So let me just plunge. Indeed, as Eric said, I had participated in the early studies. 2 I remember vividly, one on Portugal, which turned out to be prescient, I think, and one on Turkey, which is still very relevant today. Then a comparison of France and Germany, which was, again, incredibly useful, and exploited the strength of MGI, which is the granular aspect, that you have people at McKinsey who really know something about the firms in a particular sector. And when you build on this, then you say things that we didn't know, we academics or policymakers didn't know. So I think that's precious. The methodology is a very straightforward one for each sector. You measure the distance from best practice, you try to see the distance, and then you try to see why there is this distance. What are the drivers with its institutions, administrative obstacles, human capital, physical capital, other constraints, and so on? I have found the exercise to be more useful and more convincing when you start with countries which are fairly far from the frontier. So that's why I thought the one on Portugal was precious, because the distance in some sectors was so large that you could really have confidence in identifying the size of the issue and the likely drivers. Now, turning to this particular study, at the general level, I think it's largely conventional wisdom, as I say, at least on this side of the Atlantic, which unfortunately is the wrong side, but that's the way it is. Namely that there's a problem both on the demand side, that we're below potential output, but potential output doesn't seem to be doing great either, so there's a problem on the supply side. I would say, as a backhanded compliment, that the MGI strength is probably on the supply side than on the demand side, and that's what I'm going to focus on more. As I said, I think the value added in general and the value added in particular in this report is the granularity, the degree of detail that McKinsey can get to, and I think is the only institution which can do this. And for this, I must say that I found the relatively short report much less interesting than the detailed report, which I had to beg to get. You should make it more available, which actually goes into the details and explains how you construct the numbers for each sector and what exactly is going on. And in the end, that's what I learned. The general conclusions, again, I was not very surprised. Where should it go? I think, again, when you start from the detailed report, there's a lot of specific advice about very specific measures in each country. And I would hope that you turn this into a list of reforms for each country. What Macron should do in Macron 2, Macron 3, Macron 4, and so on. Now, this being said, the topic is the future of Europe, so it's not exactly a small topic, and we could pick 100 things to discuss. So I'm just going to make odds and ends remarks. So the first one is that there is, I hate that formula, but I'm going to use it. There's an elephant in the room, which is the reason why this really is in our minds, is that something very strange has happened as a result of the crisis. Hearing you, it was more about trends. Here we know that something has happened since 2008, that if you just extrapolate the pre-recession trend, we are on average, and you were right to say it's different across countries, but we're 15% below the crisis trend. And it looks, when you just look at the visuals, it looks like a drop and then a slower rate of growth thereafter. And I think it's absolutely essential, and I don't think it's settled, to decide where it comes from. And there are two extreme views. One is it's a demand gap, that basically demand went down a lot and it has a tough time going up, and the 15% is mostly demand. If this is right, then the output gaps, which are measured by extremely good otherwise international organizations, which suggest 2 or 3% output gaps, would be completely wrong. I'm not sure that that issue is settled. It could be that it's mostly demand. But there's probably something else, which is on the supply side. There's a slowdown in productivity growth and in potential output growth. And here again, it can be one of two things, and they're not mutually exclusive. The first one is a coincidence that productivity growth just became smaller, coincidental with the crisis, and that's what we're seeing. Or the other is that it is largely caused by the crisis, what Larry and I have talked about under the guise of hysteresis. And, in terms of advice that you give to countries, it's going to depend very much on whether it's mostly demand, it's mostly supply, and if it's supply, is it more or less independent of the crisis, kind of a trend changing slope, or is it due to the crisis? If it's due to the crisis, is it temporary, is it permanent? And I would have liked to have that discussion, because the 15% number is absolutely striking. That's point one. Point two is there is a lot of focus in what you've done on growth and, by implication, productivity growth. But if I think about what the problems of Europe are, I think they are threefold. The first one is high unemployment. The second is indeed low growth. And then inequality, although the inequality issue is not quite as dire as in the US, it is there and it is an issue. And so I would have personally put more focus on how to decrease unemployment rather than to increase productivity growth. And they're not exclusive, obviously, but I have a better sense of what to do with respect to the first. And I think it can yield interesting byproducts that a focus on productivity growth may not. So let me go through this with this big caveat, which is, for the moment, ignore the political economy constraints. And I'll come back to this, which is clearly issue number one when it comes to implementation. So unemployment. And unemployment for the Eurozone is at 10.5% at this point. And I see no reason, based on the need to reallocate workers and so on, that it should not be 5%. It is basically due to different labor market institutions, not fundamental reasons about differences between, say, the US and Europe. And I think and that's going to be in contrast to the next slide, I think we have a very good sense of what to do. Again, ignoring political economy constraints. If we could do it, it would probably work. And, the list there is a list that is very close to yours. Employment protection. You have a dual protection system in which it's very difficult to get a permanent job. There is no human capital build-up as a result. We have, in many countries, too much of a role of a judiciary with the uncertainty which comes with it. Collective bargaining is not flexible enough. At the micro level, in particular, there should be more flexibility. And then the one you mentioned, you mentioned education, but on the job training, is catastrophic in many countries. So the apprenticeship system of Germany basically works in Germany but doesn't exist elsewhere. It's partly due to the first bullet point, which is that the system of employment protection doesn't give incentives for firms to actually provide much training. So I think we know that if we could deal with these things, it would make a big difference. What would it do? So the first one is, if we could get from 10 to 5 over 5 years, that's 1% more. That's not forever, but, we'll take it, right? And what would be the effects on productivity, on inequality? On productivity, I think it's ambiguous, and that doesn't mean it's bad. To some extent, this means lower wages at the low end. That tends to decrease productivity. Because you get low-skilled workers to be hired again. But there's some evidence that it would lead that higher worker reallocation is linked to productivity growth. It allows firms to adjust faster. And there's some recent papers which suggest that this link is really there. And then a better system of employment protection would lead to a better life cycle for workers with more human capital accumulation. And I think that's a factor which is not negligible. So I think it would do, on net, good things for productivity. But again, this would not be the main purpose, but it would be a collateral effect. On inequality, I think it would do good things as well. A lot of the inequality comes from what happens at the bottom, and to the extent that you can get people at the bottom to be employed, that would do very good things. Now, I've gone through this because when I turn to productivity growth, it is much less obvious, I think, what the sure recipes are. You have a series of sectoral measures, very specific measures, and you think that each one will actually make a difference to that sector. But in quantitative terms, each one is very small. When you start doing enough of them, then you start having effects. But, when you do something to pharmacists, it's good, but it doesn't change the TFP growth in a way which is really visible. Then you have kind of general measures, but I think these are rather uncertain in their effects. We have to admit, and I'm not going to kid you on expressions like nurturing the ecosystem for innovation. But we don't know much more than that sentence, I think, on that one. So again, I would have put more emphasis on how do we reduce unemployment. Now, I'd left political economy issues aside, but I think they are the issue, basically. And so when you say there's a window of opportunity for Europe, I see this as slightly misplaced optimism. It doesn't seem that at this stage it's much easier, except in countries which are in really dire straits, to basically get much support for ambitious reforms. The survey that you mentioned, I didn't go back to the original document, is interesting. But I suspect people answer at a level of abstraction in which they don't think about what would happen to them. And if you say, are you willing to lose your job in exchange for? I suspect that the answers would be quite different. If you say, could there be more layoff in general, that affects them much less. So I would not take this as a strong endorsement for reform from the majority of the people in Europe. But again, we have to try. The other point I would make is that we tend too often to think about opposition to reform as stuff that we have to get over or is worthless. But it's not true. I mean, in some cases, it's indeed rents. Sometimes these people paid for the rents, which is the taxi case, and you can understand why they would be mad. But you probably want to get rid of the rent. But sometimes it's also a loss of security, of safety. And these are perfectly legitimate concerns. And again, if we care about happiness as opposed to growth, then these are things that we should take into account. So I don't think we should be too strong on this one. Now, what should we do on the political economy front? I mean, there's a striking difference between labor market reforms, where these are major battles because you're basically trying to change the status of a very wide proportion of the workers, and they will react. Product market reforms is very different. You basically have a lot of small battles, one against pharmacists, another against notary publics in France, and so on and so on. And each one may be easier to win, but again, has smaller rewards. Some reforms, it's interesting, I was going for your list, and some reforms are less politically difficult than others, and we should, again, I mean, they have less obvious opposition or fuzzier opposition, and we should think hard about which ones they are so that we can implement them first. And then, on the ultimate issue of how you go at it, it's striking how different countries are adopting different strategies. So I was next to Mario Baldassarri, who would disagree, but I think of Renzi as trying to have large labor market reforms. I think of Macron as having decided that he could not, and he wanted a lot of small reforms, mostly in the product market. I think the answer there is what mandate you have. And I think if you have a mandate for change, you have a window at the start, and you can push a big one. But in the case of Macron, Hollande was not elected with a mandate for reform, and therefore, in this case, you basically wage a lot of small battles. So it's a combination of both, but again, we have to think about how to do it. Let me move to the specific recommendations of the report. So, as I said, I mean, it's not a report that you read and say, aha, it makes me change my ways of thinking completely. And that's actually good news. I mean, enough people have worked on that if you came with something completely new, I would be skeptical. And again, I think what you learn is really about the details, and that's very useful. Maybe that's a bit unfair. Repeat a point I think that Paul Krugman has made many times in the past, I've made, but in a less visible way, which is to focus on competitiveness. And competitiveness is not the same as productivity or employment. You can be competitive at any level of productivity. And most countries have different levels of productivity, and most countries are competitive. Now, it's true that when you have fixed exchange rates, there is a specific competitiveness issue, which is the exchange rate is not right. But in general, the focus should be on productivity, employment, rather than on competitiveness. And that's an old divide between, consulting firms, I would say, and academics. This is one more iteration on that. Where I'm absolutely convinced is that you've identified a number of places where what we can call infrastructure investment can be useful, pays for itself, and therefore should be financed by debt. It will help in the short run, and on the demand side, it will help in the long run on the supply side. I think this is something that the fund pushed very, very strongly for the last few years. I think there's a very strong case for it, and you've made the case stronger. You suggest a number of things that can be done. My preference is, despite the fact that in the past this has been the subject of cheating and various abuses, the notion of having a current and a capital account for public accounts is really something that we have to think about. We know the dangers that you basically end up counting as investment, something which is not, but I still think that on net, this is a very useful thing to do. Let me just do some PR for you. In the detail report, the discussion of the productivity of infrastructure investment across countries, I found extremely interesting and progress relative to what I do. Footnote, there is one need which has materialized, which is refugees. So this is a rough computation. And so if you assume that Germany is going to have 800,000 more refugees this year, which was the plan, and that they spend about 15,000 euros per refugee, that adds up to 12 billion, if I got my zeros right, which is about 0.3% of GDP. And so it seems to me here there's something to be done again. That can probably be financed by debt, and that's something which should be explored. You also have a few remarks on this in the report. Last issue is sometimes you focus very much on growth, but I think for most of what we care about, it's really growth per capita which matters. I mean, it's the standard of living. Now, there are some issues where there are increasing returns, and therefore overall growth is useful. For example, for the budget, overall growth is useful. But I think it's important not to want growth for its own sake. We have to think about, that goes back to the point about what is it that we're maximizing. It may not be growth. I think it may be something closer to growth per capita or something more complex than that. Last slide. So I think two of your items on your list that I didn't warm to. The first one is energy efficiency. And so I couldn't quite get whether you thought that it was inefficiently done or you wanted more subsidies or more subsidies for new sources of energies or more taxes on existing ones. If it's the second, I'm not convinced. If it's the first, I didn't quite get it, and I didn't quite see what it would do to growth. And urban development, I think you took, unless there is a large literature, which I do not know, I think you took a correlation for causality. And I see no particular reason to think that urbanization is going to do great things for growth in the context of Europe. So, again, I've learned a lot. Again, I've learned a lot from the document, the longer document, not the short one, relatively short one. I think where you go with this is, again, rely on the granularity of your studies, list the specific reforms, and then just help people like Macron to write Macron 2, Macron 3, and so on. I haven't touched on everything. You talked about a lot of issues, but these are the ones that I chose. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Olivier and Eric. We're going to bring them up on stage now and take questions and comments from our distinguished audience. As Olivier said, this is well-trod ground, but as Olivier also said, the granularity or let's say real-world facts in the detailed studies of the MGI report are very interesting to go with some of the broader macro work that we've done here and, of course, Olivier and his colleagues did at the fund. Not to fill time too much while everyone gets their microphones on, I would just pick up on one point that Olivier made, which is this critical distinction between productivity and competitiveness. And every time we get into cycles of trade rounds, people want to trot out the word competitiveness, and Germans like to trot out the word competitiveness, and it turns out to be meaningless if they can't deliver on productivity. So I think it's welcome to have that perspective. That worked. Rather than my taking any more time, unless Eric has something particular he wants to respond to from Olivier's comments, I'll take that as a Gallic no.
Oh, that's I think they were.
Let me open up to the floor. As usual, we have Jessica with a roving mic in front. We have a standing microphone in back. Please identify yourself by name and affiliation when asking a question or making a comment. If you make a comment, you have a premium on being short. If you pretend it's a question, you have a little more time. Who would like to go first? Fred.
Question for Eric. I wanted to pick up, Olivier picked up briefly the recent refugee development. And in your list of strategies, you talked about pro-growth immigration. Have you had a chance yet, this goes to the granularity, have you had a chance yet to ask whether the types of migrants that are now coming into Europe through the refugee crisis meet your test of contributing to growth, being the type of pro-growth migration that you want to see, and therefore being kind of manna from heaven, as it's sometimes portrayed in the press? But the question is, what is the quality? What is the sustainability? Have you had any opportunity yet?
In fact, we're working on that, at least in some of the countries, to assess that, because as we had put in the report, the question is to get the right profiles. As we know, we didn't talk about that, but there is the aging, obviously, in Germany, in Poland, in some of the countries, the aging population, and therefore the migrants should be here to basically, get the pyramid going with the right profiles. So my answer is I don't know yet, but hopefully we'll get some perspective on that soon.
That would be
Go ahead.
But maybe,
some information from the horse's mouth. In a private conversation, Angela Merkel said that of the refugees coming to Germany, 1/3 was employable right away. They knew German, they had skills. 1/3 had to learn German but could be employed, and 1/3 was probably not employable. How she got those numbers, I do not know, but it might be a useful starting point in thinking about things. It doesn't deal with the demographics of it, but we know that most of these people are fairly young.
And of course, it takes place, and this is one point picking up on the MGI report, where if all the emphasis on labor, as our Jacob Kierkegaard, among others, has pointed out, participation's actually been going up over the last few years in certain parts of Europe. And if you were able to get 2/3 of the refugees working, that would be a comparable participation level to what you've already got in some of these countries. So it's not that outrageous. Senator.
Mario Valdassari, I have a question for Eric and a question for Olivier. The question for Eric is, you show the comparison between Europe and the United States in terms of social well-being and economic health. So Europe has the leadership in social well-being, but the United States has the leadership on economic health. The question is, since the two aspects are related to each other, how long can Europe be leader in social well-being without being a leader in the economic health? I mean, how long and how far can Europe go on sustaining European welfare without creating the resources in economic terms to get the welfare sustainable? And the question for Olivier, Olivier, I think you raised a crucial point, which is the crucial point of Maastricht, what I call Maastricht Treaty 1, which is given a target on deficit, 3%, without distinguishing between current account, at least current account expenditure and investments. So what we came out over the last 10 years in Europe, in any European countries, is that whenever we push it to have deficit reduction below 3% or to zero in some way, any kind of different government in any kind of European countries, could be center-right, center-left, or whatever it is, they did try to limit the deficit, increasing taxes, increasing current account expenditure, and cutting down investments. For instance, in Italy, we did cut investments expenditure over the last 6-7 years by 50% in absolute value. And obviously, this mix is a perverse mix in terms of growth at the end of the day, which is low growth or zero growth or whatever.
Can you get
the question to Olivier? The question to Olivier is the following. So I do agree with the necessity to have some kind of Maastricht 2, specifying the at least the 3% if it refers to investments or to current account expenditure, and it's the same with Eric. Eric says flexibility.
What is the question?
Flexibility is due to investments, or flexibility can also be allowed for increasing current account government expenditure. This is the question.
Thank you. Eric?
So two or three elements. The first one also is, as Olivier was mentioning, we talk about growth, but the GDP per capita is in fact the element we are trying to look at. It's why, as I mentioned at the beginning, the gap now is in GDP per capita of the US in the past 5 years. So we haven't computed exactly, is there 5 years, 10 years, but I would take it the other way, saying we need absolutely to restore the GDP per capita growth to be able to finance some of the elements that are important for citizens. When we talk about healthcare, we talk about education, talk about environment and the energy policy. So I would link the two at that level, saying are we able to get the growth, the right regulation, the right development on these dimensions, which includes also some public sector productivity, to try to keep the lead on the outcome for the citizen. But for that, you need the reforms on the economic side and the growth in the GDP for that reason.
Great. Olivier?
So on the two questions, one graph which is striking was how far behind Europe is relative to the US in terms of agility. And then this leads to nurturing the ecosystem.
Of innovation.
Let me try something, which is Europe doomed if it consistently is less agile and less innovative than the US? And my answer is probably not. What we've learned from growth theory is there are two ways of going. At the frontier, you have to innovate. And if you're not at the frontier, you have to imitate. And imitation goes a long way. It doesn't get you to the frontier, but it gets you rich enough if you do it right. It may well be that the US will remain more agile, that its higher education system will remain better than Europe. I think it will. Increasing returns is such that I think that game is over. And therefore, I think we may have to accept the notion that growth in Europe is largely imitative and can be sustained at a good rate. In the models of Philippe Aguillon, you go at the same rate as the guys at the frontier, except behind. And that's not bad. So I think we have to be open to the notion but to be, self-referential, that the MITs and the Harvard and the Stanfords of the world will remain dominant, that France or Germany will never get there, and that it still is consistent with growth. Just have to steal the innovations from the other side. On Maastricht, I think we agree, right? So you need, I think conceptually, you need to separate between the capital account and the current account. The capital account should be decided on social rates of return principles, and the cyclical aspect should be in the current account, so that you run a deficit or a surplus on the current account depending on economic conditions. You're absolutely right that the lack of a separation between the two, which I think was put in place because people thought that there would be too much cheating, have led to a dramatic decrease in public investment since 2008 in a number of European countries. And this would probably not have happened if it had the other structure of accounting. So I'm very much in favor of trying to go there.
Terrific. Next question. Could the two at the back head to the standing mic, please? Thank you.
Does that microphone work? Yes, it does. Peter Sturm, I'm a retired OECD official. And my question is concerning high European unemployment, and I want to link that to the maintenance of the euro. Conventional wisdom has it that one of the original sins of euro formation was to put very different countries, different cultures, different social preferences together, and then remove the safety valve of exchange rate flexibility. And that led to rapidly opening gap of unit labor costs, of foreign balances, which then led, or was one of the factors that led to the crisis of 2008 to 10. Now, this gap in unit labor cost differences has closed considerably then, as we saw from your diagrams. However, at the cost of very high labor market slack in the countries that had to do the labor force adjustment. My question is whether we will need of this labor market slack has to continue as long as the euro is maintained in order to avoid a reopening of the labor market gap in the countries that have different cultures in Europe.
Two elements. The first one also, just if you look at the history, there's been the unit labor question.
Can everyone hear him?
Yeah, maybe not. There was a question of the labor market, and there was also the question of the interest rate, which is everybody was able to borrow and to get the leverage. Some of the elements of the crisis are linked to the leverage, not only to the unit cost. So the leverage, I think, has been now under control. On the unit cost side, I think it's back to agility in my mind, because there has been a tough adjustment, which is basically internal devaluation or adjustment. And the question is, can we get through growth also? That's why growth, I think, matters, because when you adjust in a no-growth environment, this is highly painful and difficult to do. Adjusting and evolving the labor market in a growing environment towards new sectors, reallocation of human capital to the new sectors. For me, this is, I think, part of the solution to that. Because in the euro, as we talked about, you can be in a euro with different level of productivity or competitiveness, but your productivity has to be linked also to what you sell. It's a classic between the French car maker and the German car maker. You can have, you are not competing exactly the same way. So my simple perspective on this one would be to accelerate on both sides, agility and innovation, to work not only on the labor market adjustment, but also on the output evolution toward the sectors that matter and the sectors of the future. If you do two linked by the training and reskilling of the labor force, then you get, I think, a virtuous circle versus right now what has been seen in some countries as a very vicious circle in the sense of tough adjustment to regain competitiveness.
I mean, your question is a variation on can the euro work, and you gave some arguments. So let me take some of them. I think the fact that there are different cultures or different labor market institutions is not by itself the kiss of death for a common currency area. I mean, this is like the Thibault hypothesis for where people decide to live. You can have a country which offers a lot of social protection and a relatively lower wage, and another country which offers less social protection and a higher wage, and people decide where they go, and it functions perfectly well. So I don't think that the difference in cultures is the issue. The issue is, even if all the cultures were the same, is whether you can have a relative wage and a relative price adjustment in response to shocks that is needed for the country which is non-competitive to become competitive again, and for the other to become less competitive. And I think what I've learned, what I expected, but what has been confirmed, is that this is not working very well in Europe. And in that context, let me make a remark which is tangentially related, but is related to things which have been discussed recently, which is even if you had a full fiscal union, that would not solve the problem of relative price adjustment. So I think the issue of how relative prices adjust is an important issue. But again, going back to your point, I don't think that different cultures or different ways of organizing society is a major issue.
Let us not forget how little convergence there's been between the American Deep South and the two coasts across a century and a half since the American Civil War, which is very well documented and which has persisted with differing institutions and differing, arguably, cultures in a currency union and a fiscal union. Lee, you're going to have the last question.
There was quite a convergence from the World War II to 1970 or so.
But that involved huge internal migration as well.
Exactly. And it can happen, but it has more migration than the Europeans probably are interested in. The question I have is to go back to Olivier's comment about demand and the high unemployment, and Adam's point that if you're going to make structural changes, it's easier to do if you've got an economy that's growing faster and dealing with its demand problems. And now I was hoping that we could get Eric to address what he thinks, given the context and the micro-analysis of various countries, what could be done on the demand side to make some of these structural changes more acceptable.
Can I build on Lee's question a moment, Eric, and this will give you a good chance to summarize. Mm-hmm. As Lee's very astute point, and as Olivier put it, you've got, sorry about the mics, you've got these country-specific lists, but I guess rather than have you go into all that, could you give us some general observations from what you've gathered about either sequencing or the relative priorities of further labor market reforms versus financial market reforms versus services deregulation? And even if you're not going to give us the full, we'll wait to read the full screen with which countries in which order, but maybe some general propositions about where you think the priorities should be depending on the states of the different countries.
Okay.
I mean, sorry. When I read the report, that's sort of what I was missing. So that's why I'm pushing.
And that right now we are. I think it's something that we are discussing in fact with each government. Mm-hmm. We have been having a lot of discussions in January with many governments in terms of what are the implications for them on the 75%, but then also what are the implications on how do the governments come together at the European level, as we have mentioned. Maybe if I take an example, we talked about France, about Macron. When I look at France today, if there is one priority, it's labor market. There are a few things we can do on the market, and the Loi Macron number one has been looking at some product regulation. But when you think about over 10 years, what has worked, what has changed, what has not changed, where is the gap versus the best practice in Europe? That's around that. It's around the labor market flexibility, reallocation of capital, human capital, to the new sectors, which include the training. When I talk about the flexibility, the most important is retraining also. The country is spending 32 billion in retraining people with limited output. So there is also a question of improving the reskilling of the workforce. When you go to different countries, you are going to have different lists of the top three. And the most important then is going to be, there is a political element to that, which is how do governments basically make that happen? Do they have the mandate to make that happen? Do they have the program? Do they have the understanding of the priorities? But so you can get to priorities that's three or four priorities per country. Maybe that's something we're going to document. I take your point in terms of what would that mean. The second priority is to see how do we fund that, or how do we get Europe to help on the demand side and to bring the investment around that. And this for me could be along a few dimensions. I mentioned energy, I mentioned digital. I think there is something on higher education also, which is how do we get a few programs where the President Juncker has put the Juncker plan. There is some money to be spent. The question is how do you spend it on programs that are going to help on the reforms. So we have talked about spending on infrastructure. That was one of the 11 levers. But there are some elements where, can you basically help energy going and fund some of the energy infrastructure or get the European market? So for me, there are 2 or 3 elements around that can really help get both some activity and evolution in the countries, but with the funding and the help of the government, of the European Union. The last element I will highlight is I think it's important also to get to reinstall or to rewrite a European vision. Because if I go to trust and leadership, it's not only a question of measures. Measures have been documented, measures have been discussed. We are detailing some of them, but there are many other perspectives on that. But the important is to restore the trust, but also restore the vision. When we talk about the opportunities and the agility, something that strikes me in many discussions between this side of the Atlantic and sometimes in Europe is in Europe we talk about the risk, and here we talk about the opportunity. In the healthcare, for example, sometimes, oh my God, there is risk. There is risk on death. So we talk first about the risk versus talk about the opportunity. Obviously, we have to mitigate the risk. There is no issue with that. For me, we need to talk about both. But the positioning around the risk, which somehow limits the agility. You can say, if there is a risk, let me wait, let me cautious, I'm cautious, etc., etc. So on this one, I think the political group and the EU, by restoring a vision, Europe a world of opportunity, it's not only a window of opportunity, it's also a continent of opportunity. I think it's going to be important also at the top, because if there is this view of opportunities, then we can more align people in terms of, do we do these packages between the money from the demand side and the structural reforms. So that would be at least some of the elements. But I'm happy to follow up on the specifics on either countries or European programs, because we could spend a couple of hours on that.
Yeah, more than a couple hours. Yeah. So on that note, yeah, please.
Yeah.
I mean, I have, it was Eric had to answer the question, but I have one insight maybe. I think labor market reforms is indeed the most important set of reforms that Europe should do. It doesn't necessarily mean that this should be done first. I did some work with Francesco, and I convinced myself that if you start, Francesco Giaverzi, if you start in the product market and you increase competition, you decrease rents, then it becomes easier because there are less rents to be appropriated, more pressure from competition. It becomes easier to do labor market reforms second. So I think in terms of what you'd like to do, labor market reforms first. In terms of how you go at it, maybe it comes second.
I think that's really important, and it's a really fruitful way to end the discussion that Eric and Olivier and all of you have given us, is to recognize that not that in the political economy sense as well as in the pure economics, it's one thing to, as usefully as McKinsey Global Institute did, to say, here's how far you are from best practice, here's which is the biggest gap in each country, versus that doesn't necessarily map into the sequencing. It can, but it need not. And again, I would just give a plug for the book by our colleagues, Martin Bailey and Jacob Kierkegaard, the Institute, published a decade ago, which also very much emphasized the product market reform side as the necessary complement and stimulus. Thank you all very much for joining us. Thanks especially to Eric and our colleagues at McKinsey Global Institute for letting them share a bit of their 25th anniversary. Maybe they'll do us a similar favor as we approach our 35th. And finally, thanks to Jacob Kierkegaard, who organized the whole program, including this morning's very substantive session as well. This meeting is adjourned.
Thank you very much.